Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak on Citizen Television, and we are now with the Principal Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Abraham Korir Sing'oei, on the assessment in Sudan, Kenya's involvement to reconcile the warring parties, the regional stability in the Horn of Africa region, and also what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not forgetting the global politics and what seems to be a new world order taking shape post the pandemic. Dr. Korir Sing'oei, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Asante sana. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary, Foreign Affairs, Dr. Alfred Mutua, issued a statement, and this is very important for the Kenyan people. He said 409 Kenyans have been evacuated so far from Sudan since the outbreak of the conflict. And this, as according to a number by also the Diaspora Affairs Principal Secretary, Rosalind Jogu, there are 3,000 Kenyans in Sudan. That number accounts, therefore, only 13% of Kenyans who have been evacuated. Can the government account and the ministry of the remaining more than 80% of Kenyans in Sudan?
Thank you very much for that question. I think the first thing to be able to observe is that the work that has been done by my sister, Rosalind Jogu, especially in leading the coordination of evacuating Kenyans in Sudan, has been absolutely commendable. When Kenyans go to foreign countries, they're under no obligation to register at the embassy. And when a situation like this arises, what happens is that the embassy and the government makes a call for Kenyans, to come and to take advantage of the facility that government has offered. When the war broke out in Sudan, that's exactly what happened. There was a call, and there was, a demand that Kenyans should be able to meet in certain places. The process initially was meant to be from Khartoum. We were supposed to fly them out from Khartoum. It became complicated because Khartoum had been quite bombed. And so some of our people moved to Port Sudan, and some of them actually went through the Ethiopian border and others through the South Sudan border. Those most in peril took advantage of the opportunity. And I have to say that, like you have said, we're talking about over 500 Kenyans now have been evacuated. In fact, more came yesterday, for example. So we have a stream coming through. We've set in place mechanisms and structures to facilitate their evacuation. But it's not just Kenyans that are taking advantage of our evacuation infrastructure. We have evacuated our neighbors, Burundi, some Rwandese. We had requests from South Africans, and more fundamentally, Ayub. Nairobi has hosted evacuees who are workers of the United Nations. Almost 800 of them, have landed in Nairobi. And so, whereas we may not be able to account for every Kenyan, I think every Kenyan in peril in Sudan has been able to find help, the kind of help that they need. And as at this point in time, we have no report about a Kenyan in deep distress who needs to be evacuated, who hasn't enjoyed that benefit. And
in the event of a distress call, then the government is ready to evacuate them?
We have sufficient infrastructure to be able to do that.
Okay. Let's now get into the internal dynamics in Sudan, and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the Sudanese army and the RSF's Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. President Ruto is amongst the regional leaders in the company of Ismail Omar Guelleh, Djibouti, and South Sudan Salva Kiir to at least reconcile the warring factions. How far have we progressed so far with that in the restoring of stability and peace in Sudan?
Two quick observations. Number one, when again this conflict broke out, President Ruto, working very closely with the IGAD Secretariat, pushed for the holding of an extraordinary summit of heads of states of IGAD. And that summit, which met within 24 hours of the war breaking out, which in itself is unprecedented, took the decision that there had to be an immediate ceasefire and urged the parties to come back to the negotiating table. Secondly, it urged the parties to put in place measures to allow for evacuations, and to open up a humanitarian corridor. 3 members of the heads of states summit were seized with a mandate of engaging the leadership, including the 2 generals.
Yeah.
And of course, you have seen that there has been some ceasefire brokered partly by the U.S., brokered by by the Saudis, but also more fundamentally with a lot of support from IGAD and from President Ruto. And the evacuations you have seen are a result of that process. But secondly, what President Ruto is engaged in is the process of dealing with 2 issues. Number one is bringing the civilian voices into the process, because what has taken place in Sudan is a failure of the democratic transition that had been put in place by Prime Minister Hamdok before he was pushed out. And so what Kenya's position is these negotiations need to take place not just between the generals, but in fact including the civilians, so that we can ensure that the process or the outcome of this process yields an outcome that represents the best interest of the Sudanese people.
And that is the transition you're talking about to a civilian government.
Indeed, in the long term. So in the immediate term, a cessation of hostility, a ceasefire that holds beyond the 72 hours, which has now been secured. Number 2, ensuring that humanitarian assistance that President Ruto is currently mobilizing. He had a meeting with UN OCHA, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN and others, to be able to mobilize humanitarian assistance. He's offered Lokichogio as one of the sites where humanitarian assistance can be airlifted to help those in distress in Sudan.
Okay, but PS, that seems to be not an easy task for the president and his counterparts in South Sudan and Djibouti. This is just an observation made by The Guardian, which is a publication in the UK. It said the United Arab Emirates, the UAE's partners nearly and nearby, particularly in Libya, appear eager to intervene in Sudan to protect their interests. That's through General Khalifa Haftar in Libya from the north, who helped train the RSF forces of Hamdan Dagalo. While his partners, the Wagner Group, which is associated with the Russian government, reportedly offers weapons to the RSF, according to the American government. So we are stepping into what appears to be a completely complex situation, even as we want to reconcile the parties.
I think you're completely right. I think we are dealing with a very complex theater. There are spoilers who are benefiting from the chaos. There are actors who want a perpetuation of military rule in Sudan, and so we are stepping truly into a difficult situation, but it is a situation that we must confront. Sudan is the 3rd largest country on the continent. It is a very, very important state. If that space becomes ungovernable, it just expands the scope of territories that are unstable and that become then platforms, for terrorism, for insurgency, for insecurity and instability, something that is inimical to the development of our region. And we must, as a matter of urgency, and you're seeing that urgency in the work that President Ruto is doing, ensure that this situation does not degenerate from where it is. And so Kenya is in the process of building a broader coalition, including some of those countries that you mentioned. Yeah. But most worrisome is one aspect that the report by Guardian raises, which is this involvement of mercenaries, such as the groups that you mentioned, the Wagner Group. I think that is a specter that we must really, really be anxious of as a continent, because we are hearing the same group's involvement in the entire Sahelian belt. And not just the Sahelian belt, but we're also hearing of their involvement even in the context of DRC.
The former American Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa region, Jeffrey Feltman, said if you stop the fighting, he's called to the warring generals, then you eliminate the breeding ground for outside intervention. That was never heeded. The Financial Times Africa editor David Pilling observed that a classic language of 2 cowboys, that is the generals psyching themselves for a gunfight. This reckless disregard for life is a symbolism of a wider betrayal of the revolution that kicked out Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. I mean, even as you focus on the concerns of God forbid, the breaking up of Sudan. Then you have the refugee crisis, instability in the Horn of Africa region, and people coming to seek refuge here. How then do you ensure that a transition to civilian authority is therefore practicalized in Sudan? Who will heed that call despite all this grandstanding by the generals?
I think it's a very difficult call, but we must exert maximum pressure on these players to make sure that the situation does not degenerate beyond where it is. And that is why we are saying the world can no longer ignore Sudan. We need to hear the UN Security Council speak affirmatively, on this issue and putting in place measures including sanctions, on the players and sharpening those sanctions to to focus on the individuals. Secondly, I mean, we need to hear pressure from the GCC countries. The GCC countries are very important economic actors within Sudan. We need to hear a stronger voice from China. Any country that is seeking global leadership must speak to this issue. We need to hear a stronger language from Russia, and not just the US and Britain, as they have been doing traditionally and even now. So we need a coalition around this issue, and the reason why, unfortunately, this is not happening is because of the fragmentation of the global order, where, and I'm sure I'll be speaking about it, where an institution such as the UN Security Council that would have made decisions around Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to put in place even an enforcement effort, that is military based, cannot be sanctioned right now because there is a complete fracturing within the UN Security Council.
We'll talk about the world order and specifically focus on the Trump presidency and the disregard for international order. This past weekend, the president, that is William Ruto, who represents Kenya, said that was during a session with the Mo Ibrahim Governance Conversation in Nairobi on Sunday, attended by a number of dignitaries and international players. He said the African Union is dysfunctional, cannot even raise $85 million for Somalia's war against Al-Shabaab. Of course, we are partners and part of the Union to restore stability. To quote him, he said, quote, "We need a serious interrogation of the management of the African Union. Today we cannot even support Somalia," he added. "We are waiting for the European Union to give us $85 million. 54 countries, 50 years of independence cannot raise this amount to support Somalia," he paused. I mean, this is a serious question, isn't it? And that he continued, the AU chairman cannot do much because we, the heads of state, have retained all the power. What then prevents the African Union, Kenya included as a critical player, to support stability process such as the one happening in Somalia?
I think Kenya is doing its part, but permit me first to say, with regard to what the president said, what he meant to say is to express the fact that Africa can do more on its own, that Africa must demonstrate that solidarity with each other in tangible forms. The challenge has been that it's only a few countries that are lifting a disproportionate burden for the continent. And that lack of solidarity, I think, is what the president was decrying. And therefore trying to rally his colleagues around the idea that if in fact we are serious about the idea of African solutions to African problems, we need to put our money where our mouths are, so to speak. And so the point he was making is that Africa can do more. And yes, it is important to have partners such as the EU, such as the US, such as China. But at the end of the day, where the shoe hurts is on the continent, and we must be able to respond to this challenge. Kenya is involved, like we said, in the Somalia situation. We are partly paying our troops who continue to be there. And now we're dealing with the context of drawing down ATMIS. Within a year, ATMIS is meant to exit Somalia. But we have been telling the international community is that while the drawdown is important, we do not want to leave Somalia more vulnerable. We need to leave Somalia when its army is fully in place, it has sufficient capacity to be able to respond to security challenges, its policing infrastructure is fully in place, and so we do not want to rush the drawdown. of ADMIS. And that's where I think partnership with the EU, partnership with the US, and other groupings is important, including the GCC. So we're not asking only for African solidarity around African problems, but we're also asking for global solidarity. Why, for example, should it be very easy to mobilize resources, for the Ukrainian, in relation to the Ukrainian conflict? Why is it so difficult to get more support for our troops, for the regional troops in DRC, in Somalia, among other, conflict arenas? And so that's partly the conversation that I think President Ruto is trying to.
And he has time and again called for the international community also to respect the African continent and its policy processes to restore stability. Another important matter before we shift our attention to the Democratic Republic of the Congo is on, as a lawyer, of course, international lawyer, the International Court of Justice determination on the maritime dispute between Nairobi and Mogadishu. I mean, to stave off a similar situation like what's happening at the South China Sea, bringing together more than 7 countries, how then can we, in the spirit of the African affairs and what you have pointed out as the need for Africans coming together, focus on this issue, which has been a thorn in the flesh of both governments, and then that decision made by a court in a European continent? I mean, can the African leadership and the African countries resolve their own problems? Are there not mechanisms for that?
I think, Ayub, there are plenty of mechanisms. The decision by the International Court of Justice, which Kenya challenges, in our view, is the wrong decision. And luckily now, we have in Mogadishu an administration that understands that this is such a complex issue, and it's an issue that therefore requires the two countries working together. Within the African context, there is the African Borders Program that has also offered to support Kenya and Somalia in the context of reaching an amicable solution. Ultimately, Nairobi seeks an amicable solution in relation to most of the challenges that we have, whether on the security front or on the border front, or on the economic front. That's sort of the focus that we have. And so on the matter of the maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia, yes, the ICJ judgment is just one instrument. As you know, it is a judgment whose enforcement is very difficult without cooperation again. And since we want to work with our neighbors in Somalia, there is every need and there is every reason for us to be able to cooperate within that shared border. All right.
Nairobi is a refuge for refugees from Somalia, if you have mentioned, from Ethiopia. Sudan is now a concern, and you look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there are refugees who are present, and some from South Sudan who are also in the country. All this happening at a time when there are concerns of stability across the Horn of Africa region. Doesn't this stretch your capacity and the capacity of the government in dealing with, one, the refugee crisis, and then two, the general stabilization of the region? We were handling Somalia, now it's Sudan. We midwifed a peace process in Ethiopia to reconcile the federal government and the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayan forces in Mekele. There seems to be battle fronts and more doors opening. Doesn't this stretch capacity of Nairobi in terms of resources, manpower?
I think the point you make is important. Kenya is where it is geographically. We are in a rather difficult neighborhood at this point in time, but it's also an exciting neighborhood. It's a neighborhood which, if we want to nurture, I think the totality of our economies would be able to rise quite significantly. And so even though it's a difficult neighborhood, and even though you're right, our capacities are pretty stretched, Nairobi cannot throw up its hands and say, too bad, we have to shut our borders, and disallow anybody from coming in on account of the fact that we are overstretched. That would be such an un-African thing to do. Instead, Ayub, what we are doing and what we are working towards is to build, even a stronger and a more resilient and a more robust capacity within the Foreign Office, but also within, other governmental architectures to be able to meet this need. Nairobi is being essentially asked to step up. Where we are right now, our capacities are so stretched, but we are asking to step up. And that's why, for example, we are telling Parliament, give us additional resources to be able to meet these needs. Because in the end, as a more stable Somalia, a more stable Ethiopia, a more stable DRC, provides markets for our goods, which is part of the mandate of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is to advance the economic interests of Kenya. And to advance that interest, we need to enlarge our markets for our Equity Bank, for our KCB Bank, for our Twiga Foods, for our logistics company, for our Kenya Airways. We need to be able to enlarge our markets. And so we are invested in regional peace and security because, number one, of principle. Our neighbor's cry is our cry. Our neighbor's pain is our pain. But we are also involved because it is also in our interest to ensure their stability so that our economy can be able to thrive together.
Okay, and generally stability. Yes. We'll, in a short while, talk about the December 2022 U.S. Africa Heads of State Summit in Washington, where the delegation led by the President and you, and also CS Dr. Alfred Mutua, met Joe Biden at the White House. Amongst the issues, America's interest in the region. The head of state mentioned when he came to power that Kenya's policies are east, nor west. It's about the interests of the Kenyan people, and where that lies, then he said Nairobi would not relent in pursuing that particular interest. And different regimes in the past, President Kenyatta's government looked east more or less to the Chinese government. That was a concern for the Americans. And now President Ruto appears to be now striking that very delicate balance between Beijing and Washington, who are often caught up in trade wars. What is the state of Kenya's foreign policy when it comes to the international frontier, and especially amongst the rivaling superpowers?
I think what the president said in relation to our East-West sort of relationship is a historic position that we have taken. I think President Jomo Kenyatta was asked the same question, and he said, I think we look neither east nor west, we look forward. But the point to be made really for us is that our constitution predisposes as a country in terms of who to relate with best. So, for example, Article 24 of our Constitution, talking about limitation of rights, says that rights our rights, the rights in the Bill of Rights can only be limited to the extent that they are limited by law, and to the extent that they are reasonable in an open and transparent, system. So openness, transparency, democracy are values, they are principles that predispose us to work very closely with countries that are democratic, just like ourselves. That defines why we are very close to the United States. It is because we have certain fundamental shared values. But in the same vein, we are a very practical, pragmatic country. Okay. In that regard, we are very attracted to the idea of China providing and working with us on practical solutions to deal with some of the economic challenges that we may have. And we have seen huge investment by China, in our infrastructure and, and other areas. And so Kenya wants to build a friendship with countries that can make a contribution, number one, to our values, to deepen our democratic credibility and our democratic systems, but more fundamentally to grow our economy and to enable our people become more empowered in that context. And so we will continue to forge friendships east and west, but on matters of principle, we will be able to stand very, very steadfastly on the principles of the United Nations Charter. And on that, I think we will be unswayed.
Okay, we'll come to the United Nations because of the recent developments across the world, including during the Trump presidency, interestingly, because of how he had trashed binding international agreements. To the Democratic Republic of the Congo on two fronts. There's the military aspect, which falls squarely under the stewardship of the defense docket. And then there's the foreign policy front, in which the Kenyan government deployed its former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, to midwife the peace process in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The last happened at the Safari Park Hotel. You were there, the president was there, his predecessor was there, and also representative of the factions that are fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. What is the state of affairs and Kenya's involvement? To what extent are we going to restore stability?
I think just like Sudan, DRC is an extremely important country on the continent. It is, from a natural resource standpoint, the wealthiest country. From the perspective of the Congo forest, it is the largest carbon sink on the continent. Congo and DRC has experienced conflict for a long time. The UN, in its wisdom, the UN Security Council deployed a force, MONUSCO, that has been there now for over 20 years. With the joining of DRC into ESC, the premise for their joining ESC was that ESC, because it's a very close neighborhood, would be able to lend a hand towards the stabilization of Eastern DRC in particular. And so a decision was made by heads of states to deploy a force. And several countries were asked to contribute, and Kenya was the front runner in that respect. So we have a deployment in Eastern DRC. But aside from that, we have now deployments from Burundi, we have deployments from South Sudan, and Angola increasingly. And so it is a difficult space to deal with, because we are dealing with well over 80 militarized groups, each of them having different priorities, each of them pulling in different directions. And so what Nairobi is curating is what is called the Inter-Congolese dialogue. Okay. And so the Nairobi process has brought together all these actors to be able to ask themselves the fundamental question around what are the issues? How can we resolve these issues? And broadly, most of the actors agree on the fact that there is need within Eastern DRC. Part of the challenge, one of the biggest groups within Eastern DRC, has been the M23 group. And there has been a bit of tension between Kinshasa and some of the countries within EAC in terms of, do we include M23? Nairobi holds a view that if you're having dialogue, you need to bring all the parties together, particularly the party that is probably much more strong militarily. Okay. And so Nairobi, with permission from DRC, has been holding quiet conversations under the leadership of the former president, including with M23 leadership. We've been able to isolate their issues. We understand their issues revolve around political leadership, the issues around benefit sharing from resources, access to game parks, et cetera, and the refugee question, and issues around their identity, their citizenship, with one party saying that they are from a neighboring country, namely Rwanda, but they are insisting that they are Congolese people. And so trying to isolate these issues has been at the center of what is called the Nairobi process. And on the part of Kenya, we are doing what we can in the process, what we need from the rest of the world, particularly because we have huge vested interest in DRC. What we need from them is more solidarity, more partnership, more support for these processes so that they can be sustainable. And secondly, we need a process that also involves the people. We need to start seeing some kind of dividends flowing to the people in terms of peace dividends. We want to begin to see developments. Mm-hmm. We want to see, the election that is slated for November in DRC happen in a relatively peaceful environment. And so we're working together again with the EU and the African Union, right, but more fundamentally with the EAC, to make this process happen. Okay,
and as you have mentioned, because we'll talk about the parties also and the intricate complexity of what's happening in the DRC. The Americans, who you said, because of our shared values of tradition, democracy, human rights values, are concerned, though, A spokesperson for the U.S. State Department said that Washington, quote, encourages countries in the region to work together to restore peace, security and trust while respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, indeed, with the tacit support of the mission from the East African region. It went on further, quote, the state support of armed groups is unacceptable and we reiterate our concern about Rwanda's support to the M23 rebels. Our partners in Washington seem to be concerned. And I wonder then how we are going to be approaching this in the midst of the regional rivalry, counter-accusations of funding armed groups to destabilize one another. You have President Tshisekedi saying he's concerned about what Rwanda is doing. Rwanda says, no, we aren't there. We are concerned about what Kinshasa is also doing about the stability of the region in funding armed groups. I mean, how can we then address this cobweb complex of what appears to be a regional foray that we are making in the DRC?
I think the approach of Nairobi, like we said, is number one, it's, the U.S. may have its unique intelligence on the matter to the understanding of Kenyan, and Kenya in particular. We do not have, at this point in time, any intelligence to suggest direct involvement by Kigali, on the funding question in particular. I think what one must understand again is that because Kigali is less than it's less than 50, 60 kilometers from
the border,
from the border, whereas Kinshasa is 700, 800, maybe 1,000 kilometers. So Kigali is really close. Secondly, the people within that straddle that border, on both the Rwanda side, on the Burundi side, and the DRC side, are the same people. They're the same communities. And so it might be that there is quite some people-to-people interaction that is taking place, which could be construed to mean that there is tactical and strategic, and military support, by one country towards the other. But I think what is helpful in this context, Ayub, is not to adopt an accusatory posture. Yeah. What is helpful in this context is to bring the players together to resolve what has become an intractable challenge. And I think that's the approach that Nairobi is taking. Mm-hmm. That's why President Ruto, for example, was in Kigali a few weeks ago, to be able to, again, understand from Rwanda's perspective what are the issues, how do we deal with it? That's why he was a few weeks, a month or so before in Burundi as well. And so we are working as hard as we can to make sure that whatever issues have divided these parties, whatever issues have created a toxic environment for negotiation and dialogue, those issues can be addressed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And a final question, Principal Secretary, and this now is largely what's happening across the globe. There is the war in Ukraine, and clearly NATO is concerned, though Ukraine isn't a member of NATO. Finland is the latest member party to be registered as a member of the NATO military alliance. America and Washington are concerned about the trade tariffs that seem to be pitting Washington against Beijing. There is the fear of the Taiwan question by China over the same model or formula as President Putin did in Ukraine. Of course, our position was clear on what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. I mean, as a former member of the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, how are we watching all these global events? And can we make a predictable and, in the foreseeable, a proper foreign policy decision that will not put Kenya's interests at risk at any given time, despite this, what appears to be rivalry across the international scene of global superpowers?
You're right. We're dealing with a very fluid and fragmented, I think, international system. I think more than ever before, it's demonstrating the fact that it can be actually, the international system can be quite anarchic in its own way, which is quite regrettable because since the Second World War, the establishment of the United Nations and the establishment particularly of the UN Security Council was to stave the occurrence of another big war. And by and large, it has succeeded. But the focus has always been disproportionately in favor of, dealing with wars within Europe and in other geographies, as opposed to wars within the African continent. Mm-hmm. Kenya, within the Security Council, holds a view that the only thing that can protect the international system is what we call multilateralism. It is respect for the rules of law encoded within the UN Charter. It's respect, for example, to the principle of territorial integrity. And that's why we, as Kenya, when we were at the UN Security Council, we consistently voted in favor of securing the territorial integrity of Ukraine, securing its borders. Respecting that principle for us, for Kenya, is important, because if you were to interpose that, the Ukrainian reality to the African continent, and we began to tinker with borders, you can imagine the chaotic situation that we would be in. Because in 1950s, we agreed that colonial borders, even though some of them appear inequitable, would be respected just in the interest of peace and security. And so respect for the rules that govern the planet, that secure the peace of this planet, need to be the fundamental principle. And unfortunately, both the US and Russia, have several times violated these rules. We've seen unilateral attacks on other countries, whether unilateral intervention.
Annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Annexation of Crimea by Russia, for example.
Iraq 203.
Iraq 203. So we've seen these things happen. And so there's been no consistency on their part, whether it's the US, or Russia. But in this particular case, I think it's quite painful, because I think it really flagrantly goes against the principles set out in the Charter. There was no even attempt, to have that conversation within the UN Security Council. At least in relation to Iraq, we saw Colin Powell going before the UN Security Council and seeking some kind of, resolution. But in this case, there wasn't. There was just a direct, aggression, against Ukraine. And that's why Kenya is of the view that this order, including the UN Security Council, was established at a time when African countries, most of them, were not independent. So Africa's voice was never part of that matrix. There is need to be able to reimagine the global, peacekeeping and peace building and multilateral architecture in order to ensure equity, equitability, and inclusion of African voices, because in that way we can be able to build a much more resilient system.
Okay, and you talked about multilateralism twice in your statement.
Indeed.
December last year, the White House meeting, the last question, President Biden convened a meeting with the African heads of state, largely themed as the US-Africa Heads of State Summit, and summit which happened at the White House. Was it to wash away the foreign policy mess by the Trump administration? You talked about multilateralism, but he never paid attention to, for example, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was midwifed by the Obama government or administration, which he said it doesn't serve our purpose. You look at the climate agreement, which was midwifed by the former French President Francois Hollande in 2015, and even called the African continent unprintable name. Was America then in that meeting in December restoring what appears to be ties with the African continent? And did you read, was the mood one that seeks to counter the growing Chinese influence in the continent?
I do not believe so. I think the U.S. has had a fairly consistent and robust relationship with the continent. Particularly, I'm talking about, some Republican leadership and some Democratic leadership. The Bush administration, for example, is responsible for setting up a very important trade framework, the AGOA framework, which has contributed to huge access to markets for African products. It contributed to PEPFAR, which is the president's, response against what was then a big pandemic in the world, HIV/AIDS. That program actually has been able to underwrite so many health interventions, that have addressed this pandemic across the continent. And so the U.S. has actually had a fairly progressive policy towards Africa. But unfortunately, like you rightly observed, during the administration of Trump, Africa was not the focus. And, there were certain things that were said that were unfortunate. And I think what President Biden was doing, or is doing through the African summit, the Africa-US summit, is really to reboot that relationship and to articulate the vision that the U.S. considers Africa, a critical partner for democracy, for rule of law, but more fundamentally for development as well. There might be the need for the U.S. to be able to scale up its developmental interventions on the continent. And what the U.S.-Africa Summit did, which hadn't happened before, is to actually bring the power and the muscle of U.S. private sector, to a place where they could negotiate for entry into the African market, by U.S. private sector. And so in the context of Kenya, for example, you saw one of the follow-up actions was, the meeting here in Nairobi a few weeks ago by the American Chamber of Commerce. At that meeting, one of the big announcements was that a company called Moderna, which manufactures vaccines, would set up in Nairobi a 60 billion shillings investment. So the investment by private sector, from a U.S. perspective, because the U.S. economy is run by the private sector by and large, is to say, let's bring American private sector to be players within the African market, as opposed to just the American state itself doing that.
Principal Secretary Dr. Abraham Korir Singoi, thank you for your time and company. It's all appreciated. We'll have you again depending on developments and, of course, what's happening across the region, in the continent, and also across the world. Your time is all appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you too for watching the broadcast. This is Daybreak. The hashtag on Twitter has been Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. We come to a close here on the broadcast. Many thanks for your company. We never took some feedback? Okay, we'll do it some other day. Thank you for your time, because we are 11 minutes past the hour, and many thanks for your company. We'll see you on Friday here on the broadcast. Thank you. Good morning.